Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we delve into the very important issue of ecocide. We've been talking a lot about genocide in Gaza, but there's also the phenomenon of ecocide as human degradation of the planetary ecology destroys the planet. And so we're going to be talking in a few minutes with Jojo Mehta, who has been working to get an international protocol for the cessation and penalization of ecocide by the major corporations and governments. Before we dive into that domain, I want to continue our reflections on what is taking place in Gaza. You may have heard the news that today there's a complete massacre of Palestinians who were surrounding some trucks full of humanitarian relief. The Israelis opened fire with their soldiers, also with drones and tank artillery, and literally massacred hungry, defenseless Palestinians. Over 100 were killed outright. The latest count as of a few minutes ago was 107, and over 700 people were injured in one of the worst single massacres in the last 5 months of the war against Gaza. It's hard to take in the enormity of the crimes that are being committed against the Palestinian people. The Israeli government said, well, it was the Palestinians' fault. They weren't in orderly fashion, and that the Israelis felt threatened. And one of the reasons for that is because the Israelis have been systematically shooting any of the police, the Palestinian police, or any of the civic organizations that have been trying to maintain order, of hundreds of thousands of people who are starving to death. And so when the few trucks are allowed in, obviously young people and women and children, literally swarm the trucks, not to cause disturbance, but to get food, because of the 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza. 2.3 million are hungry, and it's estimated that nearly 600,000 are in incipient starvation. There was reported that another 6 children died of starvation in the last 24 hours. It was also reported that this massacre took the death toll past the 30,000 mark, which is about 1.3% of the Gazan population. And to give you a measure of what that means, if the Israelis had been suffering a 1.3% casualty rate, death rate, in their civilian population, over 120,000 Israelis would have been killed in the last 5 months. 120,000 Israelis. Had this happened in the United States, over 4.4 million people would have been killed, mostly women and children, in the last 5 months, with another 300 million Americans on the edge of starvation. Let's all just take that in for a moment. 30,000 dead Palestinian women and children equates to 120,000 dead Israeli women and children, and nearly 4.5 million American women and children, with the rest of the population on the edge of starvation. The hospitals are reporting that they can no longer provide any real assistance to any of the casualties. The dead are being buried in groups because they're running out of land in the cemeteries. All they can provide to the starving, all they can provide to the wounded are literally Band-Aids, no serious surgery. There's no power in the hospitals. There's no anesthesia in the hospitals. The surgical equipment was used weeks, if not months ago. And still the Israelis, with the full support of the Israeli population and Jews around the world, with some important exceptions, but very few, are focused on the genocide of their cousins in Gaza, most of whom have Jewish blood. It's an extraordinary thing that the Israelis are killing off in front of all of us women and children in the most barbaric, pornographic way. And this is a stain on Israel that will not be forgotten. It's a stain on Judaism. It's a stain on the United States. And in particular, it's a stain on Joe Biden and the US Congress, who, as Ralph Nader has said, are guilty of crimes against humanity as an institution for supporting the ongoing genocide against the Palestinian people. And I find myself speechless that not only is this continuing, but that this country, the United States, is aiding and abetting everything that is being done with full, wholehearted support. All the weapons, all the artillery, all the bombs say made in USA. And the hand-wringing of Joe Biden and Anthony Blinken are just that, hand-wringing for public assuaging while the military machine continues against the Palestinians and increasingly against the Lebanese people. So how we stop this is a matter of increasingly urgent concern. And I have no sense that it's going to stop anytime soon, but we will continue to bear witness to what is happening in Gaza until the killing stops. Every day, we're going to look at that genocide with open eyes and a breaking heart. We cannot, as civilized people with any kind of conscience, stand by. I'd like to turn now to another domain where, like what the Israelis are doing in Gaza, is a crime against nature. And we all know that over the last several centuries, and in particular since the end of the Second World War, the human race has been devouring the planetary abundance, destroying the planetary ecology with abandon, without restraint, just like what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. It's without restraint. And yet, in the face of that, there's been a development that we want to talk about today. And that is a conversation with a woman, Jojo Mehta, who's an activist who in 2017, in partnership with a barrister there in the UK and legal and environmental activist Polly Higgins, started a group called Stop Ecocide in an attempt to get the political bodies, whether it's in the United States or in parliaments around the world, to identify crimes against the environment that were destroying the biodiversity and the capacity of the environment to be regenerative, to call it what it is. It's ecocide. They've been beavering away and they've had some successes. So I'd like to invite Jojo Mehta to join us and tell us what she has been doing to stop ecocide. She's right now in the UK. And so, Jojo, welcome to Humanity Rising. And why don't we begin? Tell us a little bit more about your background. Tell us how you got involved in concerns about human degradation of the environment and how you came to co-found Stop Ecocide and the developments. And then we will have a dialogue for the balance of the time. But welcome.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. And of course, always, following that update that you just gave from the Middle East, it's obviously starting from a position of, wow, a real kind of quietness and an acknowledgement of, the horror of which we are capable as humanity. But I would also like to bring in here, as you intimated, there have been some remarkable successes in the work that we've been doing to have ecocide, or the worst harms to nature, recognized as the crimes that they should be recognized as, whether that be at the national, the regional, or the international level. And I suppose to start at the beginning from my story, and then to sort of dive more into the broader story, I guess I always had a kind of a deep thread of care and concern for the earth that came through my mother, who was a singer, it still is, in fact, a singer and a songwriter, whose deep inspiration was always the earth. So I kind of grew up with that sort of deep thread unspooling around me. But it wasn't really, I suppose, until my 30s that I started to become what you might call an armchair activist. So, writing to my local MP, parliamentarian, filling in petitions, that kind of thing. And feeling, quite fine about doing that, feeling like I was doing my bit. And then there came a point when I heard about fracking. Now, many of you may have heard about this. It's an extremely polluting and actually very uneconomical way as well of extracting oil and gas from the ground. And when I first discovered this back in 2013, I think it was already underway in America. They were thinking of bringing the technique to the UK, where I live. And I found it extraordinary that, that anyone would try and engage in this for any, I mean, there didn't seem to be any reason whatsoever. Even if you purely looked at it from an economic perspective, there was no angle from which this worked. And my little daughter, who was 5 at the time, overheard me talking about fracking, and she burst into tears. And she said, "Mummy, I don't understand." She said, "If they're poisoning the ground, they must know they're poisoning themselves. You're going to have to call them and tell them to stop." And she said that in her 5-year-old way. And I remember thinking at the time, my God, this is so obvious to a 5-year-old. It should be obvious to everybody. And she actually said, "Mummy, there must be someone you can talk to." Because, of course, I was thinking, I can't just call up these big companies. And I ended up speaking to our local parliamentarian, who did that classic politician thing of sort of, dodging my questions. And I came out of that meeting feeling like, that must never happen again. And I started to inform myself. I wrote leaflets, I gave talks, organized demonstrations, got very involved in the anti-fracking community in the UK. And it was through that I met a remarkable lawyer, legal pioneer, really, a barrister, Polly Higgins, who she just had a very simple way of addressing a simple proposition for addressing mass harm to nature. Just make it a crime. Tell them they can't do it anymore. And it just seemed so obvious. And we started working together in 2014. It was very much a kind of kindred spirit kind of thing. And she'd already been working for a few years on bringing awareness around this concept of ecocide, of mass damage and destruction being described as ecocide. And when it came to 2017, we actually got together publicly to start this campaign, which is now an international advocacy NGO, Stop Ecocide International. Polly, sadly, is no longer with us. We lost her to a very rapid cancer in 2019. But the initiative itself has grown 1,000-fold. It is moving very, very fast at the moment. And I will go more into updating you on what's been happening, in the initiative globally. But perhaps it's worth just doing a brief dive into the origins of ecocide as a term, as a sort of legal initiative, if you like. It was first used, in fact, in 1970 to describe the awful damage that was created in Vietnam by the defoliant Agent Orange. And it was first used on the diplomatic stage by the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme in 1972. And that was in Stockholm at the first UN Environment Conference. And I recently actually read, because a couple of years ago, 2022, there was the Stockholm Plus 50, so 50 years since that conference was celebrated. And actually that was the time that I first really read through the Stockholm Declaration, beautiful declaration that came out of that environmental conference, but also quite shocking in the sense that in reading it, I realized that many, if not all, of the things that were being enumerated as the problems, the damages that were happening to the environment, the things that needed to be done about it, were as valid now, if not more, than they were then. So, it couldn't be more relevant to be talking about ecocide now. But at the time, there was some interest over a few years, but it kind of took a bit of a political and legal backseat for some decades, and resurfaced in the 1990s when the Rome Statute, which was to become the governing document of the International Criminal Court, was first being drafted by the International Law Commission. And at that time of the drafting, there was actually a clause that potentially would have covered severe, widespread and long-term harm to nature, in other words, ecocide. But it never made it to the final treaty that was signed in 1998. And we don't know exactly why. There doesn't appear to be any record of a vote. But we do know that there were certain countries that objected to the inclusion of this clause. And they were, perhaps unsurprisingly, the US, the UK, France, and the Netherlands, all, interestingly, oil states, and all at the time, at least involved in or considering being involved in nuclear testing. So we can see perhaps why there were the reasons why the clause was dropped at the time. But it's worth having sort of taking a moment to just kind of sit and feel and think about what might today's world have been like if, when the International Criminal Court opened its doors in 2002, it had actually included the crime of ecocide alongside genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, which were the 3 crimes that originally made up that treaty. We might be in a very, very different place today. And one of the best ways perhaps to envisage the importance of criminalizing the worst harms to nature is to think about that and to think about what might have been averted. You know, what horrific disasters, whether it's Deepwater Horizon, where we know there were safety protocols that weren't followed, whether it's the Chevron case in Ecuador with the horrific pollution from toxic tailings ponds, whether it's maybe even Fukushima, where there were design recommendations that could have been followed and weren't. And you know, mass deforestation in the Amazon, you know, these kind of huge destructive activities and you know, practices and disasters that might have been approached very, very differently, you know, as projects or as the companies involved in them, had it been the case that if they were found guilty of that, they would actually personally have been held criminally liable. And that was what inspired Polly Higgins when she was looking into ways to legally protect the planet. And, you know, she started off with the nature rights concept, which has now grown since and has also become a kind of global movement. And there are over 30 jurisdictions where particular landscape features have been given legal personhood. But what she realized was that, of course, it's important to have rights. And actually, you know, our basic human right is the right to life. But of course, what protects that right to life is the fact that to take away that life is a crime. And so she realized that the importance of criminal law in this is that it's where we draw the moral parameters. It's where we draw not just the legal, but the moral red lines. It's what we use to indicate in society what is unacceptable, what is unsafe, what is in fact dangerous for us. And so that's why she dedicated effectively the last 10 years of her life to, you know, bringing this conversation to the fore, having it discussed in many different arenas over many years, and ultimately to co-founding with me this organization that is now, we now have associate groups and teams in nearly 50 countries around the world. So this is a conversation that is growing very fast. And there have been some key milestones in this journey. One of them, tragically, was actually the death of Polly, because at that time, you know, the community, her following, who had effectively been converted to our early membership, when they heard about her diagnosis, and it was all very fast. I mean, she died a month after she was diagnosed. Everybody was terribly upset and shocked for obvious reasons. And people were saying, well, what will happen to this work if she dies? And, you know, will it die with her? And actually what happened was the exact opposite. When Polly left, so many people got in touch. Politicians, campaigners, lawyers, you know, saying, often directly inspired by her and saying, you know, what can we do to help? And they approached me as her closest associate. And actually what happened was, you know, I mean, literally, I barely had time to cry. I mean, there was so much connecting that started to happen at that point. It was literally like she was a martyr to the cause. And perhaps people who had, I mean, this is very understandable. It's a kind of a human thing. You know, when you've got a very strong figurehead for something, sometimes, you know, others will sit back and say, well, you know, I don't need to do that because Polly's doing it. And of course, when she was no longer there was suddenly this kind of impetus to, well, you know, how do we do this really important thing of making it a crime to destroy the planet? And that sort of dot joining exercise, if you like, is what has grown and grown and grown over the last few years. And perhaps, you know, something that we did because we couldn't do anything else at the time, which was just talk to anyone who would listen, has actually become a kind of concrete strategy. And actually where we operate now is sort of on two layers. It's at the diplomatic level, where we meet in more closed door situations with politicians, diplomats, and so on, talking about the developments of legislation at the top level, but also a large part of our work, as anyone will know who's followed what we do, is feeding the public conversation, building that conversation, and also kind of cross-feeding it through different sectors, whether that's, and that can, you know, that ranges hugely from environmental activism to investment banking. I mean, you know, really through everything in between, academics, experts, NGOs, and so on. Really encouraging this conversation to grow, because that's what actually moves the dial at the political level. So moving on to the end of that year, that same year, which was 2019, the conversation was once more replaced onto the diplomatic level. And it was done so courtesy of one of the world's smallest and yet most incredibly courageous and pioneering countries, and that is the Pacific Ocean state of Vanuatu, which is a country that, there's no other way of putting it. It punches well above its weight diplomatically. They're extraordinary what they've achieved in the last few years. And it was Vanuatu in 2019 that stood up at the Assembly of States Parties at the International Criminal Court. So that's the gathering of all the member states of the International Criminal Court, the ICC. And that happens every December. And they stood up in that year in 2019 and actually called on all the member states to seriously consider adding ecocide as a fifth crime to the Rome Statute. In the meantime, since the founding of the court, of course, a couple of years previously, the crime of aggression had been added. So there were 4 existing crimes. So that brought the conversation back onto the diplomatic table, if you like. And conversations started to happen, for example, in France and Belgium. But the next really big milestone, and probably the single thing that has made the biggest difference to this movement, to this conversation, to this, clearly becoming established legislative direction, if you like. And that milestone was the emergence of a definition of ecocide. And that, there had, of course, been definitions over the years previous, but it had always been, on the whole, had been a lawyer or a small group of lawyers saying, well, we think it should be a crime and it should look like this, which is all very well, but doesn't necessarily have the credibility for a government to then take that forward. But in 2020, we were approached by Swedish parliamentarians who were interested in seeing a sort of consensus, heavyweight, credible definition of ecocide emerge that they could actually take to their government and say, could you propose this at the International Criminal Court? Could you propose an amendment to the Rome Statute based on this? And on the basis of that request, we were basically sort of empowered to contact really some of the top lawyers around the world to bring together an independent expert panel to define ecocide. And that panel ended up being 12 lawyers from around the world, chaired by 2 remarkable lawyers who you may have heard of. Philippe Sands-Casey, a British-French lawyer who works a lot at the international level, in fact, gave a spectacular testimony around the Middle East situation just very recently at the International Court of Justice. And so he co-chaired that panel. And so did a remarkable Senegalese jurist called Dior, who had a lot of international criminal law experience and was also very familiar with the term ecocide, having been on the panel of judges for the Monsanto People's Tribunal. So with that kind of group of lawyers that came from all different geographical, ethnic, gender backgrounds, but also different legal backgrounds, so climate, environment, criminal law, humanitarian law, but also varying ideologies. So we had someone from the International Law Commission. We had a former ICC judge, so quite conventional voices, if you like. But we also had who you might call people's lawyers, the academic jurist Valérie Cabanes from France, an extraordinary voice in the Francophone world for ecocide law, but also Pablo Fajardo from Ecuador, who represented the indigenous and local people in the Chevron case. So, a really broad range. And what that meant was that the definition that emerged was truly a consensus. They all had to concede something in order to reach that definition. And it had a remarkable impact. Now, I'm going to try something, and I'm not entirely sure whether as a webinar this will work, but I'm just going to see, firstly, I could try it by sharing my screen. I'm not sure if that's going to work. But the other thing I can try is if I turn my video off, you should see the definition on your screens. Maybe if somebody could tell me in the chat if you can actually see that. Can you see that definition?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, so this was the definition. This is the core of the definition that emerged from that process. So ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. And I'll just leave that there for a moment so you can see that. And obviously there are also definitions of the terms, what does severe mean, long-term mean, etc. But this is the core of it. And it's so wonderfully compact that it actually, I'm going to show you this because it's such it's so remarkable and so useful. I'll come back online here. Hold on. Is that the core of it fits on the back of a business card. Now, you wouldn't believe how useful that is if you're dealing with busy politicians who just never have time to read through a 20-page report. But the key thing about it, and I'll just show you it again quickly, is that you've got two different thresholds there. So the harm has to be severe. It also has to be either widespread or long term. So we're not talking about chopping down the trees on the village green. We're talking about, really severe level crimes. They need to be international level. But they also have to be unlawful or wanton. Now, it's funny because when the panel of lawyers were discussing this, and I was present for the plenaries because I was convening them. It was fascinating to hear all the discussions as they sort of debated all the different aspects. And I thought when I first saw that, well, what do you mean unlawful? I mean, surely we want any activity that is that severe to be covered. But in fact, what I realized through hearing the conversations and of course, and also through thinking this through, is that there is a huge existing body of environmental laws around the world, and it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And it is governments who need to move forward with adding this legislation to their penal codes, which means that they have to feel safe and they have to feel sort of justified in doing so. And they also have to feel like their toes are not being trodden on. And if you're just going to kind of run in there and say, well, whatever law you had before, now this is what the law is. So it's going to cut across whatever you've already got. It's not going to work politically. It's not going to be able to move forward. But also, having that unlawful aspect there recognizes a couple of things. It recognizes that actually the majority or a very large proportion of the worst environmental harms are actually already illegal. And this really highlights one of the things that is really, that really kind of cuts to the heart of why this law is so important. And that is because, with all the environmental regulation and protective law we have in place, it's not taken seriously enough. It's often not followed, not enforced, not monitored. And in fact, even existing environmental crimes are now as lucrative in the criminal world as drug trafficking. I mean, they're up there as like third or fourth most profitable criminal activity in the world. Things like illegal logging, wildlife trafficking, the kinds of crimes that already exist in the environmental space. And yet they're not reported, investigated or prosecuted at anything like the same level. So effectively, what we've got is an issue where, there's an awful lot of law breaking happening already, but it's not taken seriously enough. And so putting in place this kind of foundational piece at the criminal level, which creates personal criminal responsibility, and that says that the worst harms are severe, serious crimes, is actually fundamentally important. And so that kind of unlawful aspect speaks to that as well. What it also speaks to is the fact that there are many activists, experts, academics, NGOs working on improving environmental regulation in many different areas. And of course, as they do so, this definition becomes stronger as you go. So it's dynamic and it's kind of future-proof, if you like. And so that's quite important. But then the wanton aspect means that even if what you're doing is permitted, if the damage is disproportionately severe, that can still be caught within the scope of the crime. And finally, it's worth mentioning that this is a crime that operates on recklessness. So it's not quite like genocide. Genocide, effectively, you have to show intention to destroy a people in whole or in part. With ecocide, it mostly doesn't happen that way. It mostly happens as a really horrific side effect of other activities, undertaken usually at a huge scale, often by very big corporations. And it's happened in the past that people have said, well, hang on a minute, are you saying that, if I'm a farmer and I'm damaging my field, I'm somehow responsible for ecocide? No, it's not that kind of scale we're talking about. We're talking about mass deforestation. We're talking about really severe levels of harm. But the main point I wanted to make with all of this is that definition landed very well. It landed in the media, it landed in the political world, and there has been a huge upsurge of interest politically all around the world, and in the legal arena, in the academic sphere, but also actually concretely at the level of policy. And what we are now seeing, and this has really evolved over the last couple of years, what we're seeing, I mean, even in just the last 9 months, there have been half a dozen different countries where proposals of ecocide law have been put into parliaments. And also, I mean, really, really key, we've seen a discussion at the EU over the last couple of years where many parliamentary resolutions have supported the idea of an international crime of ecocide. But, more concretely, the EU directive on environmental crimes has just been revised. And literally this week, the European Parliament has adopted the agreed text, which was finally agreed in November of last year, on the revised environmental crime directive, which now effectively includes cases which are described as comparable to ecocide. So the EU is taking a massive step in the right direction. And that is really also pushing the conversation at the international level so that those who are talking about it at the level of the International Criminal Court, where we've been sort of nursing and nurturing that conversation for several years, ever since Vanuatu's statement back in 2019, doing side events and, just raising this issue and having it talked about. And that is now effectively shifting in terms of the flavor of that conversation. It's no longer a sort of, is this going to happen? It's more of a, how is this going to happen? So, perhaps, bucking the trend of some of the really awful news that is coming out of different parts of the world right now, this is a bit of a story of hope, because what we're actually looking at is putting in place a kind of safety rail, a sort of guardrail parameter, if you like, that can help guide us through a transition, so that hopefully we are not just looking at a just transition, which is what the EU is talking about. Lots of people are talking about trying to make it a just transition. It also has to be a safe transition. We have to make sure that we're not just jumping from the fossil fuel frying pan into the rare minerals fire, for example. And the way that we can put a framework around that is to simply say, whatever you do, it should not create this level of harm. And that is ultimately the sort of fundamental shift that this work is beginning to sort of catalyze in the world. And just to round off this kind of introductory presentation, I suppose I would be remiss if I didn't mention the context of conflict. Actually, of course, an enormous amount of ecocide happens just all the time in peacetime as well. But it does also happen during conflict. And actually, the other country that has been very, very vocal about ecocide has actually been Ukraine. Where, as we know, there's been huge environmental damage as a result of the Russian invasion, as a result of the conflict that has been going on for now just over 2 years. And in particular, the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam last June was what you could almost think of as a sort of textbook case of ecocide. And President Zelensky has many times raised this word and this issue. And Ukraine, for example, has pushed very strongly in the Council of Europe, not to be confused with the European Union. Council of Europe has a bigger number of countries, 46 countries. And the Council of Europe has also resolved to encourage all states and at different levels to criminalize ecocide. So that's also coming from Ukraine, and acknowledges the fact that, during wartime, completely understandably, particularly, speaking to this audience who've just heard this update from Jim, of course, during wartime, the primary concern is about human harm. But what we also need to remember is that conflict often creates really huge harms, environmentally speaking, which last beyond the time of the conflict, it lasts into the future, and obviously have then still have effects on human lives, but also often extend beyond the geographical area of the conflict as well. So those are further considerations and further reasons why it's so important that international criminal law does take account of environmental damage. And I'll just round off with the fact that the chief prosecutor from the ICC has actually just issued a public consultation around environmental crimes, because there's a realization that international criminal law does need to address environmental destruction. And what they're looking at first and foremost is what they can do with the existing provision, the existing text in the Rome Statute. I'll be completely honest, it's not a huge amount, which is why we need an additional crime of ecocide, but it's very important that they are now focusing on this aspect. So I think I'll leave it there for a sort of introductory presentation and look forward to having more conversation with Jim.
Thank you so much. A lot of information there in a few minutes.
Yeah, it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the whole thing.
Let's kind of back up for a moment and consider some examples from a history as to what you would say if you had to kind of pick the most egregious examples of ecocide, say from a corporate point of view against the environment, kind of over time. What would be the examples that you would raise for our attention?
Well, I mean, if I were a lawyer, practicing and looking at how these cases might be taken, I would probably be slightly reluctant to point fingers just because you never quite know till you're dealing with an exact situation. But the kinds of things that we would potentially think about is like I say, is a good way of thinking about it is what kind of things might have been avoided. And I tend to go to the way that there is a reckless disregard for the kind of damage that can happen when, for example, safety protocols aren't followed with the transport of oil. I mean, big oil spills that, destroy whole swathes of the sea, ecosystems, coastal species and so on. But also, things like mass deforestation, where effectively you're looking at perhaps the impacts of industrial agriculture. You could be looking at also just at illegal logging, but when it's done on a kind of a scale that effectively is destroying whole swathes of vital ecosystems that are also absolutely key to climate, for example, as we know that forests are and coastal systems are. I mean, some other examples, I mean, as I say, it's a little bit difficult to be precise about it because this is actually not yet codified in many places. So we're working at the moment with a proposed definition, for example. But I mean, just in the UK, I mean, I think about, there's been, I mean, I know that this is a very global audience. But for example, there's a big express train project in the UK that's known as HS2. And I imagine that had this law been in place, it's not to say that that project might not have happened, but it might have happened very differently. And the reason I say that is that the route they decided to run this train through went through 108 ancient woodlands. The scale of that is just phenomenal. And I have absolutely no doubt that if you really wanted to run a train from A to B, you could do it without doing that. And so there are kind of there are different kind of scales and ways of looking at this. It's both a way to, in fact, do you know what, I've almost started thinking of this law as a kind of a Swiss Army knife. It has different tools according to where you're approaching it from. So for example, at the level of holding multinationals accountable, for example, that is one thing. So looking at those who are wanting to take cases against big corporations, it's a fantastic legal tool in your toolkit. So there's that aspect. And there's also the aspect from the perspective of those board directors. I mean, we've actually had CEOs of mining companies, can you believe, in confidence, coming up to us saying, please get this law through, because I want to be able to say to my board, we have to do things in a different way, because we can't do them in the way we've been doing them before, because it will become criminal. And so there's this sort of way of seeing this also as an incredibly useful set of parameters for those that are making decisions that could potentially be ecocidal. It actually shifts things. And this is an interesting point, is that one of the things with existing environmental law is that mostly it is in the regulatory sphere. And it's often very long and detailed, lots of do's and don'ts, exactly how much of a certain toxin can you use in a certain context before it crosses a red line, that kind of thing. Whereas when you approach it the way that this remarkable definition approaches it, by saying, if you have the knowledge that something you're doing could create a certain level of harm, then, doing that thing or, creating that harm is the problem. You actually shift the consciousness, because instead of your great big companies, you know, their risk managers and their legal counsels sitting there and thinking, you know, how do we avoid falling into these categories, or, you know, sort of crossing this particular line, or even how do we just weigh up the costs of a court case against the profits we're going to make? And instead, they have to start thinking, what are we actually doing on the ground? And does it actually create that level of harm? So what you're doing is you're creating a kind of thread of kind of a reality check that you're putting into the mix that actually forces a shift in attitudes. And I think that's actually as important as it is to potentially kind of point the finger and say, what, oi, you know, that shouldn't have happened, which is also obviously fundamentally important. So as soon as a case is taken, this will, you know, obviously this will land very, very seriously for people. But what it's actually intended to do is to change behavior. It's meant to be a deterrent. You know, ultimately, you know, murder isn't a crime to punish murderers. That's how it works. But what it's actually for is to stop us killing each other.
But there's also a lot of examples of murder that one could point to. It would seem, Jojo, that we would have some very clear examples. Like, for example, would you consider what's going on in the Amazon to be ecocide? And I want to get into some of the complexities of this because it seems easy, but I think your reluctance to name is also an indicator to me of some of the complexities. So, for example, it's clear that the Amazon is being destroyed, in part because of the negligence of the Brazilian government, in part because of the burning of the forest by farmers as they expand their fields, in part because of various oil drilling and other corporate interests. But oftentimes, ecocide has many parents. It is not a single actor with a deliberate, I'm going to murder X, and you plot, and then you kill them.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's almost like it's more akin to sort of manslaughter than to murder, in the sense that, you know, that actually
that's exactly right. That's
you know,
what I'm
often what these big companies are actually setting out to do is to make money effectively. And you know, the ecocidal collateral damage is what is happening. Now, obviously the term ecocide has been actually quite familiar to people in the Amazon for a long time. I mean, if you speak to the indigenous land defenders out there, you know, they will tell you that, you know, for them actually it's a genocide and an ecocide kind of mixed together. You know, that they're actually experiencing. Now,
and then who do you hold accountable? Is it the Brazilian government?
This is very
it the
interesting,
land?
isn't it?
Is it the corporations?
Yeah. Well, in terms of the International Criminal Court, you're looking at individuals, actual people, not corporations, but people. Now, actually, in practice, when this is sort of evolved and transposed into national and maybe regional law, you will actually see corporations also implicated, which you do see, for example, in the EU legislation that is in the process of being adopted. You actually see potential, you know, penalties for corporations of percentages of turnover and those kinds of things. But you're absolutely right. Looking for causation is key, because in criminal law that needs to be quite clear. So, you know, you can well imagine that early cases of ecocide, once this is in place, will probably be ones where there is a fairly clear-cut act or omission that has led to a pollution incident, you know, and as the jurisprudence builds up, it will become easier and more kind of codified as to how one can approach slightly more complex cases. But at the same time, I think, you know, I mean, in a way, what you're speaking to is it's sort of the same thing that I was speaking to before, although you may not have realized it, but is that when you put in place something that says you could personally be liable for the result of your decisions if it creates this severe, widespread and long-term harm, you're actually kind of going quite high up the production chain. You are not looking at the local
Good point.
this is really important. It's really important because it's not, obviously a lot of the ecocidal activity can happen in the so-called developing world, in Latin America, in Africa, these places where also I will hasten to add, there's a big human rights element also mixed in with it. But often the original decisions that lead to those situations, when you follow the production chain back up to the top, you realize that actually it's often someone in a boardroom in the wealthy north that's actually, given the okay for a project that is ultimately going to create this level of harm. And that is why this is so important, because I think one of the things that, I sometimes call it the corporate PR machine, has done a fantastic job on all of us, like over the last, 20 odd years, where we're all individually supposed to be responsible for climate change and ecological breakdown. Now, that is not to say that we don't have responsibility. Of course, it's important what we do with our wallets, where we put our dollars, etc. But let's be honest, because actually, to truly live ecologically, you have to be really wealthy. And most of the world can't afford to do that. And it's not their fault in the first place. I mean, if I walk into a supermarket and everything's covered in plastic, that's not my decision.
Well, let me ask you this, just to take an example. Shannon MacArthur just put in the chat a very interesting point that the EU just extended for another 10 years the use of glyphosate. Oh. Now, we all know about glyphosate. The science is in. So by your definition of ecocide, I would say that the parliamentarians who voted to allow 10 more years of this poison into the EU are guilty of ecocide.
That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it.
Let's not go into one way to look at it. If we're dealing with eco, it's like it in Israel. I don't want to let you get off the hook.
No, Jim, I'm not trying to get off the hook.
It's either ecocide or it isn't.
No, it's ecocide if the law's in place. This is what I'm trying to say, is that it does matter. It matters. It does. The point that, excuse me for a second.
No, but is the EU guilty of ecocide?
The law isn't in place, so they can't be. This is my point. Had the law been in place, they might not have made that decision. That is precisely the point.
So until the law is in place, you would say they're not guilty of ecocide?
Criminal law doesn't work like that. It's not retroactive. So, I mean, the whole point, if you want to change behavior, people have to be able to see a law coming. Because otherwise, it's like if you want a law to be changed, a government has to change it. Yeah, it has to. That's the way it works. So if you basically,
but wait a minute. Just because the International Court of Justice is not adjudicated on whether Israel's committing genocide in Gaza doesn't mean it's not happening. If what you're saying is that it's not until the law's in place,
but with genocide, the law is
taking place. That doesn't seem to be a kind of a morally consistent position. It is because the corporations and the governments are committing ecocide that you and Polly Higgins and others are trying to get some legislation to stop it.
Okay, so the difference is whether you're looking at it legally or morally. Morally, yes, completely agree with you. Legally, because something's not in place, it can't be actually taken as a case. You can't, I couldn't, for example, as a lawyer, say that they're guilty of something when there isn't a law for it. Actually, it's not the same as what's happening in the Middle East, because there is a law for genocide. But in terms of the concept of ecocide, you're absolutely on the nail. I mean, for my money, one of the first considerations would actually be the agriculture industry, because one of the first things that is going to fail us globally are the soils, because that is how fast we are destroying soils. So yes, so those kinds of decisions would absolutely fall into the remit of consideration when somebody is making those decisions. I mean, the whole concept of ecocide, absolutely right, is the destruction of soils. So yes, in that context, yes, the destruction of soils is ecocide, but that's not quite the same thing as saying, is this particular person legally, criminally guilty of something if the law doesn't exist? I don't know if I'm making myself clear here. But
well,
yes,
no, that's the problem, that they can get away with it with complete impunity. But I just wanted you to name what it actually is, that the EU, in extending for another 10 years the use of glyphosate, is actually engaging in ecocide.
It's an ecocidal decision, yes.
It's an ecocide. Thank you. That's all I wanted.
But I do have to put the caveat around that I'm saying that in a conceptual sense, not in a legal sense, because the law
Yeah.
I have to be very careful with this because I deal with ambassadors and diplomats, and it's like I have to, I'm not going to sit here and point fingers because that's not going to help my case. This is all about what we all know needs to happen, and we all know it needs to move in that direction, and those people, and nobody's going to deny that, but that what they will do is work around whatever is or isn't there. That's the whole point of the whole thing I was saying earlier about how companies will basically say, oh well, we're not doing exactly that because that's actually allowed and that's not allowed. Actually, what we want them to be doing is making that reality check and saying, well, hang on a minute, what level of harm is this going to create? And actually, no, we can't do that anymore.
Yeah, gotcha. And I was thinking back in terms of US history, I would say that ecocide took place with the intentional wiping out of the buffalo. When the settlers first came, there was countless millions of buffalo upon which the Native Americans relied, and part of the strategy of the US government, and in particular the US Army and the settlers, was to intentionally slaughter the buffalo until they literally went to a point of extinction. And just a quick little story. In Texas, the only reason why we have buffalo today is because an Army captain did not follow the order to kill off the last of the buffalo, and he secreted them away. And that's why we have bison now on the American plains again. But I would say that was a deliberate crime against ecology. And also, and that's an example of what you were saying, where ecocide is often intertwined with genocide. And I would point to another example, just to get your comment, is what's been happening in Ecuador with the Achuar, with Chevron Oil and several other big oil companies, where they went in and intentionally poisoned the rivers and the streams to wipe out the indigenous populations, so they wouldn't have to deal with opposition to their oil drilling. And I would say, in my view, that Chevron and Texaco and the other Shell should be had up for ecocide.
And if as I say, if that law had been in place, you can bet your bottom dollar they would have thought twice about doing that. Because actually there's something very different about criminal law compared to, civil cases. I mean, look at that Chevron case, the perfect example, because actually, with all the amazing sort of advocacy that happened around that, and the actual success of the court cases where, Chevron was actually fined billions and billions, and they haven't paid any of it. But that's a completely different scenario to, do you know what, you personally are potentially liable for this. And that the thing is, with personal criminal liability, you've got a completely different ballpark that you're playing in, not least because it actually trumps those kind of, civil laws and sort of and also trade agreements. I mean, if you're looking at something like the the Energy Charter or whatever, where you're seeing these companies holding governments to ransom because for sort of loss of earnings and so on, you can't do that when you're dealing with criminal law. I mean, ultimately there is a bottom line. I mean, I'm not saying that it's necessarily kept to. I mean, obviously we know people do commit crimes, but effectively, you can't go to a government and say, can I have a permit to kill 500 people for my new infrastructure project? I mean, you just can't do it because it's
Yeah.
criminally insane and forbidden. And
Yeah.
effectively, the whole point of putting ecocide into that category is that you create that additional bottom line where you just can't go there. And, you know, you
Gotcha.
can't
Yeah.
finance it. And actually, what gets really interesting is when you're talking with insurance people, for example. I mean, I remember the first conversation I had with someone who came out of the insurance industry and was asking me, you know, where do you put ecocide in the kind of risk and governance frameworks? And I was like, well, look, this is a criminal law. So wherever you put kind of, you know, murder or those kinds of crimes, that's where potentially you'd put ecocide. And you could see him kind of having these kind of crazy sort of moment in his head where he's like, but hang on, that's uninsurable. And I'm like, well, yes, that's the point. You know, you can't insure crime. So yeah, that's kind of a large part of, yeah, the whole point of it, really.
You know, and one thinks of what's going on with Fukushima, where they're deliberately releasing contaminated water into the Pacific Ocean, knowing that it's contaminated, sending out press releases that it's been processed, but everybody knows, particularly the fishermen in the area, that it is not. That seems to me that I would take even a more fundamental position. I would say that nuclear power is ecocide, that when you build a nuclear power plant, you know you're building a system that is going to be spewing out radiation for the duration of its life, 20 to 30 years, that is going to be damaging environment, damaging people, and then producing radioactivity in the form of plutonium that has to be stored somewhere for tens of thousands of years. That feels to me to be ecocide.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, in the nuclear context, for example, you could probably, I mean, I don't imagine that you could call the creation of a nuclear weapon ecocide, but you couldn't possibly call the use of one anything else. You know, I mean, well, actually, you could call it other things as well, but you certainly would have to call it ecocide. You know, and in terms of I mean, a generation of nuclear power is an interesting one. I mean, I wonder whether, you know, obviously with those issues in the 90s around nuclear, you know, whether that may have come into it or not, but, you know, or whether it would simply be that one would simply approach these things in a very different way, and they may therefore prove to be both unadvisable and uneconomical. I mean, let's look, I mean, Fukushima, I mean, for me, Fukushima is a case in point, in the sense that, to the best of my understanding, there were design recommendations that, had they been followed, would have prevented that disaster from happening.
Exactly.
You know, and
Exactly.
so, you know, but of course, as I say, so had this law been in place, they quite conceivably would have been followed, and that would have been prevented. And that's not obviously fixing the, you know, that's not necessarily fixing the question of whether nuclear is the right kind of power to be producing, which is kind of where you're going. But it does certainly point out that the kinds of disasters that we've been witness to might well not have happened had this been in place.
Yeah. Well, let's just turn, as we begin to draw this to a close, to the momentum that you're developing, which is significant. And tell us more about, what are your priorities as you look ahead to the remainder of 2024 and into 2025, for how we can get this notion and these pieces of legislation broadly accepted?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting point. And I also just spotted someone in the chat saying, you know, how are we going to bring in new laws and we can't even, you know, we're not even getting the current ones followed. Well, actually, one of the important things we believe with bringing ecocide law in is that actually it creates a sort of foundational support for existing law and has people take it much more seriously. I mean, you can imagine that, you know, a board of directors looking at its environmental obligations is far more likely to tick the right boxes if there's the threat that they could, you know, end up in jail if everything goes wrong. So that's one aspect. But in terms of, the moving forward, like I say, the conversation's really shifting. We are seeing a clear legislative direction of travel here. I mean, for example, Brazil is actually one of the countries where, an ecocide law proposal has been put into parliament. It's already got through its first stage of the environmental committee, which is really interesting. And, yes, it's going to meet some resistance. There's plenty of Bolsonaro still there. But, it's moving forward. There's proposals been put forward in Spain, in Mexico, in Italy, in the Netherlands, in the UK. This is a conversation that is really rolling forward. And of course, with the EU developments, there will now be, from the point of the final formalization, which I think will happen next month, you've got then 2 years for 27 states to actually transpose that into their national law. And they don't have to do it exactly the way the EU's recommended. That's the minimum. They could actually, go the full 9 yards and actually use something like the definition that we've got at the international level. And then, of course, what we're looking at the International Criminal Court level is the potential for an actual amendment proposal to be put forward. There's been lots of discussion over the last few years, but I think, we're now approaching a time where this is people are, governments are seeing the writing on the wall. There's a sense that this is something that is being talked about. It's moving forward, and as this often happens, at the diplomatic level, what they're looking to is, who else is doing this? And it's like, oh wow, the EU is doing this. That's serious. And so there's a kind of coming together of some of the more forward thinking Western states, but also those victim states like the small island states that are kind of going underwater and suffering the sharp end of climate change, really kind of stepping up and saying, well, this is not good enough. 23 years or however many, well, it's now, gosh, it's nearly 30 years of climate negotiations has not actually made the difference it needs to make. We need to put something in place that has teeth. So those are the kinds of conversations that are starting to emerge at that level. So, and from our perspective, it's all about the conversation. It's all about who's talking about it, how seriously they're taking it. And that is obviously what then pushes at the policy level. So, it would be, obviously, warmly welcome this audience to have those discussions with their networks.
Yeah, and then finally, I'd love to have you talk, Jojo, about the relationship between this momentum to stop or to penalize ecocide and this other momentum around the rights of nature, because it feels to me it's almost like two sides of the same coin, that as the consciousness has emerged over the last several decades, that nature has rights, nature's alive, nature is mother, and that she needs to have the same rights that any of the species that she's gendered to have would require. It feels that's sort of a positive way of putting what the law prohibiting ecocide is describing in legal, I would say, almost more negative terms. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right. There's definitely a two sides of the same coin thing going on. I mean, I mentioned briefly earlier how, your right to life is protected by the fact that it's a crime to take that life. The same, obviously, potentially is true in the sort of nature rights sphere. The sort of rights of nature are protected by a criminal law of ecocide, for example. And the nature rights movement is really gaining a lot of ground now. And I mean, we actually, interestingly enough, we think of ecocide as a step towards a more general acceptance of, the intrinsic rights of ecosystems. And we also have to look at the fact that, as civilization, we are constantly dealing with a balance. And this is what, it's one of the things we need to learn from indigenous cultures, for example, is actually how to live in balance with the natural world. I mean, actually, you can't build a house without damaging some level of the environment. Human existence damages the environment. We cannot get away from it. And this is one of the problems legally, is that environmental law is always a balancing act, because you can't save every last little insect or plant. But at the same time, we have totally lost perspective on how, on the unacceptability of literally sawing off the branch we're sitting on. So there is this huge range that in terms of a relationship with nature, and there's something about the legal rights for nature that is it's kind of the logical end of the paradigm shift, if you like, that ecocide law is a sort of piece towards. I mean, we see ecocide law as sort of almost an acupunctural strategic intervention into the existing system, just adding a crime to a list of crimes. It's perfectly within the bounds of existing legal paradigms, but it shifts the mentality actually in quite a profound way.
Yeah.
And that in itself then moves towards a more, a broader understanding of, what we need to respect and how we need to have a relationship that is reciprocal with nature instead of purely extractive.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. This has been very illuminating. And I really like this way we've concluded that the rights of nature and the law against ecocide are really intertwined around the growing consciousness that is understanding the living qualities of the natural ecology that surrounds us and gave rise to life and sustains life. We have to pay attention to that and both honor it and stop those elements of human society that seek to destroy it.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you, Jojo. That'll bring us to a close for today, everyone. You'll see the link to the after chat in the chat box. And then we'll see you all again here tomorrow when we're going to go into a discussion of the latest events that are transpiring in Ukraine. Thank you, Jojo. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
See you tomorrow.